Henry Dundas will become his lawyer, and Dundas magnificently defends his young client, and the young black, I think he was Jamaican, young black Jamaican is set free.
Hello, OneSunnyDay.com podcast. Today, my guest is Patrice Dutil. He is a professor at previously Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan University. His latest book, Unexpected Louis Saint Laurent, published by University of British Columbia Press. Hello, Patrice, and welcome to the program.
Nice to see you.
The topic is going to be Henry Dundas, back in the news.
Yes.
And I wanted to go through the life of Henry Dundas and how he came to Providence, and then you can respond to some of the criticisms that are leveled against him.
Well, Henry Dundas, let's plunge into history. Was born in Scotland. He was born in Edinburgh in 1742. He comes from a family of wealthy lawyers. His father was a member of Parliament in London, and very much implicated in legal affairs and court administration. I think he was the head of the courts in Edinburgh. So he comes from a prominent family. He's born in a house on the Royal Mile. The Royal Mile, if you know Edinburgh, is that stretch of street between Holyrood Castle and Edinburgh Castle. I say this because I was lucky enough to go to Scotland a few years ago, and I walked that Royal Mile. It's a beautiful place. But 1742, it was really, the high street of Edinburgh society. It's very much a courtier street. Um, and Henry Dundas comes from that, and he'll follow in his father's footsteps. He'll go to the best high schools in Edinburgh, in the city, and goes to Edinburgh University of Edinburgh, becomes a lawyer, and is expected to take his place as his father's successor, as a leading member of the legal society and as a member of Parliament, and he'll do that. Henry Dundas will live up to his father's expectations, no doubt about it. But at the same time, Henry Dundas is very much inspired by what we call the Scottish Enlightenment. Um, a dozen odd thinkers, all men, who were rethinking the assumptions of their society. And they're very much part of the Enlightenment, that movement in France, parts of Germany, that wanted to, parts of Italy, wanted to get rid of the old world, wanted to sort of vacate the shop-worn ideas that kings are appointed by God, that you know privilege and had no limits, that uh, the establishment was the way things were for a good reason and were likely to perpetuate themselves. The idea of democracy uh, was not particularly popular. The Enlightenment people, these intellectuals who still define our day, who still define us today, we're more inclined towards evidence. We're more inclined towards democracy. We're more inclined to betterment. More inclined to betterment. How can we make society better? How can we make the economy better? How can we rethink our values? What governs us? How do we govern better? And that's the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Where do we put the things that belong to God with God? Where do we put the things that belong to man with man? And Henry Dundas is very much part of that. He's very much a man of the Enlightenment. He follows those thinkers. So, I mean, to give you, I mean, again, well, this is the young man who grows up. He's influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment, people who would have been around his house and who are rethinking the assumptions of their society.
So Henry sounds like he's doing okay.
Yes, he is.
What's the world like? Like when you step off this mile, are people poor?
Scotland is doing very poorly. Um, and people are very depressed in Scotland. Again, yeah, I'm generalizing here. Scotland is really at a time of real distress, in the sense that it has been fused with inside the United Kingdom since the early 1700s. There's a great deal of dissent inside Scotland in the sense that a lot of people do not want to be part of the United Kingdom. And a few years after uh, he's born, there will be a clash, a major clash in Scotland between British forces and Scottish forces. And basically the issue will be resolved at that point that Scotland will become a loyal part of the United Kingdom. And that's been an assumption that we're only now revisiting, with the Scottish independence movement. So, yes, Scotland is poor. Scotland is divided politically. It's also divided socially. There are many rich Scottish landowners, and there's all the poor Scottish Highlanders. And by the 1750s, 1760s, well into the 19th century, you're going to have a movement of the poor Highlanders quite literally being taken off their land and shipped off to the United States, and to the United States. And of course, as you know, when Canada moves from the French Empire to the British Empire, there'll be a lot of Scots who will be moving to Canada. But this is, we're talking 1740, so a great deal of division, a great deal of poverty. Scotland is poor. The British Empire is developing. You have a sense of power in Scotland that, the future, not just Scotland, of course, but Britain, that the future belongs to that country as it develops colonies in North America. But there's also some thinking about Africa. There's some thinking about what's happening in Asia. This is all being swept up by the sort of the first wave, the first successful wave of British colonization. So um, Henry Dundas is part of that. I mean, he grows up in that environment. He'll be in his 30s by the time of the American Revolution. He's in his 20s by the time Canada switches from French to English. So he's very much a man of that period. And that's very important to keep in mind. People today, when we're talking about Dundas Street in Toronto or in Mississauga or in all sorts of towns across Ontario, or Dundas County, Dundas, Ontario, which is part of Hamilton now. This is the Henry Dundas that is that Dundas. So it's of a different world. It's a completely different world, and Henry Dundas is part of the class of people who are thinking through the governance of all those issues. How do we deal with this globalization of the economy? Again, we're talking the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s when he's at his most active. So that's the kind of context from which he emerges.
What is the mechanism by which you're just a Scottish peasant minding your own business, and then all of a sudden you're on a boat to,
Yes.
the new world, like it or not?
Well, I'm prompted to say that you really have to read Diana Gabaldon's books, Outlander. Uh, she covers all this. This is a fictionalized treatment, and I'm a big fan of it. Um, but here's the process. Uh, you're a peasant. You're part of a clan in the Highlands of Scotland, and the landowners say, well, you know what? This land would be much more profitably used if we gave it over to sheep. Yeah, sheep. And we don't need these people. They don't give us any money because they're too poor to give us any rent. It's basic subsistence farming. So we don't get a whole lot. Let's get rid of them. And so they actually create emigration societies to get the Scotsmen out of the Highlands and onto a boat, onto many boats. That's how it is. And it's forcible expulsion of the Scots. Again, at the same time as you have this enlightenment. So there's a lot of things happening in Scottish society. It makes it a fascinating time.
Is this part of the leadership's idea of it's all of why is this society not prospering? We've got these people who are farming this land, they're not producing much. We've got this king who's living somewhere, he's not doing anything. And how can we change everything?
Yes. Yes.
So the thing is, to me, the Enlightenment process, which is described as progressive, to me is like Back to the Future, because if you read a book about the BC, the BC Romans or the BC Greeks, this is their whole package of ideas, set down literally as how to do things. And then there's kind of like a detour, and then it's almost like somebody picked up these books and went,
Yes.
These guys have an idea. Let's see how this works.
It's part of the Renaissance, right? It's the latter half of the Renaissance where people across Europe are saying, well, what were the ideals of the Greeks? How can we recapture democracy, the voice of the people, the role of the people in government? And fundamentally saying, this idea of a king, this idea of a God appointed monarch is simply no longer valid. Now, again, the Scots are a lot more moderate. They're not like the French. They're not like the French who say the king has no legitimacy whatsoever. The Scottish Enlightenment, the Scottish thinkers are more likely to say, a king is not a bad thing. A king can be a uniting factor in a society. They represent tradition. They represent the better parts of tradition, not the bad parts. We have to sort of make do with that. Um, so the Scottish Enlightenment is very much more moderate. And a lot of people have argued that, the Scottish Enlightenment is very much a part of the Canadian thinking. It's not an accident. We were populated by a lot of Scots for a long, long time. Canada was dominated by Scots in banking, in business, all sorts of businesses, and in government. Let's not forget that our first two prime ministers in this country, Macdonald and Mackenzie, were both Scotsmen, both born in Scotland, and came as children or as young men. And the key leader of the opposition, George Brown, was also a Scot. So I mean, it's not an accident. We are very much the inheritors of the Scottish Enlightenment in this country, much more than in the United States.
How does Henry rise to prominence?
Well, he basically he works through the ranks. He distinguishes himself as a lawyer and really makes a name for himself when he defends a young black man. A young black man who winds up in Edinburgh, having been shipped as a slave by a Scottish slave owner. And this young man, you know, winds up on the streets of Edinburgh and says, "Well, wait a minute, why should I be a slave here?" And he starts to make waves, and Henry Dundas will become his lawyer, and Dundas magnificently defends his young client, and the young black, I think he was Jamaican, young black Jamaican is set free. How did this happen? Dundas pleaded that there were no laws in Scotland that justified slavery, simple as that, and that therefore this young black man had to be set free. That's how he first made his name. Again, he rose to prominence, he gets elected to parliament, he becomes friends with Pitt the Younger, the prime minister, and at the same time you have the French Revolution, and you have the acquisition of the Northern Territory of North America. He moves to London. I mean, so he becomes a minister, Minister of the Interior for the British government, and he will continue until his death as a very influential Scotsman, probably the most influential Scotsman in the British government until his death in 1811. So that's basically the trajectory of Henry Dundas's career.
So that's what the appeal is to the Canadians. The
Yes.
Canadians have a lot of Scotsmen. He's a famous Scotsman, well-regarded Scotsman, and that's why they're naming things off of a famous.
He's a minister of the Interior. He's a secretary of the Interior, as they called in those days. And he appoints this guy Simcoe, the first lieutenant governor of Ontario. He also appoints this guy Osgood as the first chief justice of Upper Canada, the one Upper Canada is created in 1792. So not surprisingly, Simcoe, the lieutenant governor says, well, okay, I've got to name some streets now. Who am I going to pick? It's not a big feat of the imagination to say, okay, well, it was Henry Dundas who sent me here, Lord Melville. So we'll name this street that runs east to west, uh, Dundas Street. Yeah, so simple as that. It's not very complicated. Toronto was nothing. I mean, it was called York, and it was established by Simcoe in the late 1790s. He moved the capital from Newark, which we now call Niagara on the Lake, to York, which is now Toronto. And he had to create a grid. That's what lieutenant governors did in those days. and one of the streets happened to be Dundas. So with this Dundas Street that we have today, goes back 225 years. It's quite remarkable.
So that's the basics of how we ended up with Dundas.
It is, Greg, but I have to say this though, and this is an important point that I've made in various talks and presentations. I mean, we know it as Dundas, and yet, until this controversy broke out, I'm sure you never, ever, ever thought of Henry Dundas.
Didn't even concur once.
It never occurred to you once, and there's a good reason for that. It's because it's never been referred to as Henry Dundas. It's an important point. I know we're talking about Henry Dundas because we like history, but the reality is that in Toronto, Henry Dundas is a non-factor. It's nothing. It's never been known as Henry Dundas Avenue. It's never been identified. Henry Dundas has never been identified. Some cities, I'm thinking of a lot of cities in Europe, will actually have, below the street sign, a little signifier, George Dundas, 1742, 1811. We've never had that. It's not part of our tradition in Toronto. We just don't do that. We're in the new world here. We don't care about history. We don't do that. So for 225 years, Dundas was just Dundas, like any other street, like Jarvis, like Bloor, like Thompson, like anything, Woodruff. It's just a name. It's just a name. But it became political. It became political in 2020, and we're now having a discussion about what is the significance of Dundas Avenue. So I'm giving you history because you've asked for it, but the reality is that in Toronto, Dundas means absolutely nothing. In Toronto or in Mississauga or in other parts of Ontario, Dundas means nothing.
I mean, it means that the street is traditionally called this, right? And
Yes,
so people
yes,
are used to the street being called this, and then you can say there's a momentum to the history. So if somebody comes up and says, "I want this changed," your next question is, "Well, why do you want it changed?" So I figured out the charges against Dundas as to why this should be changed. Now we'll table for a second if the people that want the Dundas Street changed care at all, right? We'll get to that in a second, if you know what I mean. But when they present it, they present it as if that we're making a reasonable request based on the life of this person.
yes,
They're
yes,
not the petition to rename the street doesn't say we want the street named because it's almost a better argument because nobody knows what this name means and we can revive the
yes.
significance with something else. That would be an interesting argument, but that's not their argument. Their argument is, and I printed it out because I don't want to misstate someone's thing. So we'll go through it, then we can discuss whether this is what I always say. If somebody says this is they're making a group, they're making a political action, and they state this is what this political action is about. At first blush, you have to take them on their word, right? Like maybe down the road you say I don't quite believe this because your logic's not adding up, but we'll give them the benefit for the doubt that this is actually their complaint, right? So what the petition said was that the petition was created in solidarity with long-standing demands by Black and Indigenous communities and their allies for governments and institutions to address systemic racism, colonial violence, and white supremacy embedded within statues, monuments, street, and place names. These demands took on a greater urgency following the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police in the context of a global protest that followed this horrific crime. In Bristol, UK, people toppled the statue of enslaver Edward Colson. In Montreal, a statue of Canadian Prime Minister John A. Macdonald was decapitated. In Toronto, monuments of King Edward the Seventh, Macdonald, and Edgerton Ryerson were covered in pink paint. These actions and other like them called attention to the immediate need for Torontonians to address how racism reflected and celebrated in our city. More recently, discovery of 215 children buried in unmarked grave in Kamloops Indian Residential School in I can't say the First Nation territory name, I apologize, has furthered the urgency of this undertaking. And then, so why is this important? So, in all fairness, why they're saying why they think this is important. The legacy of Henry Dundas, first Viscount of Melville, is highly problematic. So here's what he did. This is the theoretical complaint. As MP in Westminster and Secretary of State, he actively participated in obstructing the abolition of slavery of the British Empire in 1791 to the end of his political career in 1806. Slavery was eventually abolished in 1833 and officially in British North America in 1834. But Dundas' actions to preserve the profiteering of his friends and the slave trade cost tens of thousands of lives, if not more. Is that accurate or is that inaccurate?
Completely and utterly inaccurate.
So, what historical points do they have wrong? What do they have? What are they basing? They have a pyramid of ideas,
Yeah,
but at the base of their ideas, there's something wrong, in your opinion.
at the core, and your summary is very good. But there is a report that came out of the city, and at the core of the argument against Henry Dundas is the fact that in 1792 he intervened in a debate in Westminster in the House of Commons and amended a resolution of the House of Commons with the word gradual. So the resolution was proposed by a fellow called Wilberforce, who is a very well known abolitionist, William Wilberforce. And Wilberforce started in 1791 to introduce this resolution. And it was a resolution that basically said that slavery should be abolished. It failed in 1791. Henry Dundas gets involved and manages in 1792 to insert an amendment, a friendly amendment that says gradual abolition of slavery. For that act, he is being condemned. Now, here's the thing. It passed. That resolution passed the House of Commons. The House of Commons approved that resolution. It's the only time it ever approved that resolution, and it approved it because it had the word gradual. Now, is this a demonic thing? Henry Dundas gave a long speech, and in his speech he said, this is how we're going to get rid of abolition. And he gave as a deadline the turn of the century, 1800. We will get rid of slavery. This is my plan. It's not a trivial thing here. All right. He's the Secretary of War at that time, and Britain is at war with France. So that's the accusation against him. And then it gets embellished that he expanded slavery, he perpetuated slavery in the Caribbean. He's accused in that City of Toronto document of defeating Napoleon in uh, in 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 Egypt because he was the Secretary of War, and this was a bad thing because it allowed the British to expand their colonial empire to India. Now, again, I just don't follow that kind of logic. If Henry Dundas had not defeated Napoleon, and this is, and I say this as a French Canadian, you know, defeating Napoleon was a great turning point in the British Empire. It's not something to be ashamed of. Napoleon was a terrible, bloodthirsty dictator. Defeating Napoleon has always been part of the great mythology of the British Empire. But in Toronto in 2020, this is a cardinal sin. And so Henry Dundas not only is accused of having extended slavery, justified slavery, but he's also accused of not being able to stop the expansion of the British Empire. It's all silly. It's all completely nuts. It's a misreading of history. Um, Henry Dundas was a friend of black people. He was an abolitionist all his life. Wilberforce was not an easy man to get along with. He was very much a purist in his views. He was not practical. The only time that the resolution passed was because Dundas helped. Not only did Dundas put his words on the line, he actually got Scottish slave owners to withdraw or to be absent for the vote in the House of Commons that day. These are people who owned slaves. These are people who were, very much in favor of the slave trade, and he got them not to vote, to abstain during that vote. So he put his money where his mouth was. He was bold in his day. He was an impressive man of enlightenment, and because of this horrific distortion of history, people are saying that the name Dundas is unworthy of Toronto. I mean, it's again. I think it's important that we divorce the name of Dundas because we've never identified Dundas Avenue with Henry Dundas publicly in this city. So that whole issue is very much academic in the worst sense of the word. It's irrelevant. But if you are going to attack Dundas, then we might as well, you know, deal with Dundas and show how the city staff. I mean, this is what's important, Greg. It's not just me and others talking around some sort of a seminar table. You have the mayor of Toronto who's bought into this. You have city council that has bought into this. You have staff that has, I think, this that I will argue has completely distorted history in order to justify this. And we're now looking at an expense that could be worth $10 million, $6 to $10 million just for the renaming of the street. The city of Toronto was told a couple of weeks ago by a businessman that he calculated that if you're going to rename because now the word Dundas in Toronto, if this goes forward, the name Dundas is now synonym of racism. How can you call yourself Dundas? I mean, the mayor of Toronto has said that Dundas is racism.
To CTV News, he said the Dundas Street that was named after a person who, oh, sorry. The Dundas that the street was named after is not a person who is deserving in 2021 or perhaps any time of this kind of recognition.
I'm very disappointed in Mayor Tory. He's so completely misinformed on this. It's sad. It's very sad. Anyway, the word Dundas now becomes synonym of racism. So all these businesses are going to have to change their name. And the guy who made a presentation to City Council a couple of weeks ago estimated the cost at up to $100 million. Come on, we can do a lot better with that kind of money.
Yeah, this is the Ryerson contagion too, because what happens is once one person says, "Oh, we're changing the name Dundas," right? The argument of the history, or if that was right or wrong, goes by the board, and they say, "Well, why does this one agency care about people's feelings? They care about people's feelings. They care that people are comfortable in the city, and you don't care." uh, Dundas and Hamilton. You don't care about people's feelings, and this kind of logic, once it gets steamrolling, is really hard to reverse because in the meeting when somebody stands up, right? The logic tree that they have to back down is crazy, and then when you sit there and you say, "No, hold on a second, Henry Dundas was,
A good man.
yeah, exactly. A good man. Made his bones defending a black slave, was an abolitionist from the start. And your problem is that in his mind, politics is the art of the possible. And this was what he could get going today, instead of making the perfect the enemy of the good.
It's a lack of courage. And, the same thing you could say is with Ryerson and the same thing with McDonald. We've made a fetish out of these individuals. Uh, the Ryerson thing is exactly the right parallel. Edgerton Ryerson was never a racist. He was never anti-indigenous. What has developed is a complete misunderstanding of his history. And I know you've talked about this on another podcast, so I'm not going to get into it. But the logic is the same, and it's basically the demonization of one individual because of what he may symbolize in the minds of a very, very small minority, very few. But the end result is the same, where Canadians are being told that their history is nothing more than some sort of a racist experience, where people of ill will are being celebrated, and that our history is nothing more than a pillage of colonial experience. And I reject that fundamentally.
When you get to these questions of slavery and these questions of societal change, right? It's not just bravery. It's the fact that, I mean, because I went through some U.S. Civil War stuff, and there's lots of people that write letters in even the U.S. Civil War, and they can tell slavery is not popular and it's dying, right? This is they're like the South's infatuation with slavery in the United States is not winning us friends around the world, guys, right? But when you get them to how are you going to unroll slavery? They lose because they don't have to hand a practical way to do it. And the idea uh, um, of saying, "Hey, slaves, you're free. Walk down the road and see how it works out." They're like, that's like a recipe for nightmarish starvation and privation. Anyway, so the point is the point is that you can also be beset by a lack of imagination, right? You have to imagine how things can be better, and not it's not it's it because the question we're now talking about is, should he have gone with this gradual abolition or this like knife like abolition, right?
Well, the knife life. Well, you were talking about Henry Dundas here.
Yeah.
The reality is that it wouldn't. It was not that Henry Dundas could have jumped up and down and stood on his head and did anything he wanted. The House of Lords was never going to abolish slavery in the 1790s or the 1800s. It will take 1830 to abolish the 1830s to abolish slavery. But Henry Dundas, where he can, plays a role. He appoints Simcoe in Upper Canada, and he tells Simcoe two things. Number one, abolish slavery in your territory. It doesn't get abolished immediately, of course not, because you still have people owning slaves in Ontario. But you're no longer able to trade slaves. You're no longer able to acquire slaves. That's fundamental. That is the product of a Henry Dundas appointee in Ontario, in Upper Canada. The same thing with Osgood, the Chief Justice of the High Court in Upper Canada. He is appointed, and when members of the Legislative Council protest Simcoe's rule about slavery, Osgood is the one, as the chief magistrate, who says no, slavery is to end. We are choking it off in Ontario. This is where Henry Dundas appoints his friends, has a direct hand in ending the practice of slavery in Ontario. It takes time. It is slow because people in Britain are adamantly opposed to abolishing slavery. The King George III, does not want to abolish slavery. He's making a lot of money. The noblemen of Britain are making a lot of money off the British trade. Henry Dundas is one man. He is not profiting from slavery. He's doing all he can to end slavery. It's a fundamental misreading of history. But again, we're sort of stuck in this two issues debate, aren't we? The Henry Dundas, Henry the man, Henry Dundas the man, and then the issue of the street. And I've said from the beginning, these are two issues, but they're completely separate. Dundas Street has never been known as Henry Dundas Street. So if we're going to get rid of Dundas Street, then we're getting rid of it. Why? Because of some flimsy association with Henry Dundas. And if that is the case, then it's wrong. Or because we've associated the name Dundas with slavery, slave owning, with racism. And I'm saying that's wrong too. There are a lot of people called Dundas. There are businesses called Dundas, and they should not be tarred with the racist brush. They're not racists. Just because they're called Dundas doesn't mean they're racist. So why would we get rid of the name Dundas? And as you say, I think it's an important point, what you're raising. It's been part of our tradition for 225 years. People have been born on Dundas. They grew up on Dundas. They got married on Dundas. They had families on Dundas. They shopped on Dundas. They worked on Dundas. This is something we've had in this city for 225 years. Why would we get rid of something that has been one of the very few things that has been a continuing thing in our past? Why are we so keen on getting rid of our past?
Because okay, so I have the five, because I read a bunch of negative stuff, and I pulled out the 5 attacks. There's one really interesting one that I'll say, that there's this quote. It says, he was also the last British MP to be impeached for embezzlement and misappropriation of funds, though he was not convicted.
Yes.
What I would like to note, what's weird about this is it's a departure from the Roman Greek paradigm. You would think that if there was an investigation and you were exonerated, you could say, well, I wasn't convicted, Therefore, someone has looked into your charge.
Yes.
This is a plus.
Yes. He was absolved.
I was absolved of it. But I'm see what I mean? This is the mechanistic thinking of you're kind of losing these pillars of Westernism where you say, well, you're innocent until proven guilty. Well, you definitely have to be innocent if exonerated and not convicted. You have to go back to these charges didn't stick. But it seems like the idea, it's like a tarring, right? The idea is, well, you must, the implication here is that he must have done something bad
Yeah. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be accused.
Well, I think we hold to the idea that there has to be some standards to the truth. And as you point out, he was never found guilty. He was accused. People are accused of anything, of everything. I mean, people in public life are accused of all sorts of things. You have to prove them. And the accusation doesn't stand on its own as something on which to convict. To convict historically.
In the minds of the people running the charge, it does, though. For them to write this and put them in the petition,
I understand that, and I'm opposed to that kind of thinking.
mental paradigm coming. But I'll read off the charges first because I have that as the last sort of thing. That he acted against Indigenous interests in Canada.
Yeah, and again, he was deliberately. I mean, he gave Simcoe and the governor of Lower Canada, explicit commands to forge strong allegiances with the Indigenous community of Upper Canada and Lower Canada. And all the governors did that. That's why the Indigenous people supported the Empire in the War of 1812. I mean, this is not a trivial thing. To say that Henry Dundas was part of the genocide, because that's the implication, is simply wrong. His argument was that we need the Indigenous people to defend against American expansionism. And he was absolutely right. He was being strategic. And the relation, again, I'm not discounting the injustices that befell the Indigenous people after that, but certainly in this period, it is wrong to say that Henry Dundas was in any way, discriminating against Indigenous people or belittling them or dismissing them as anything other than important allies in the, in the in creating a bulwark against American expansionism.
One of the problems um, with people saying, well, the English colonialists should never have come to North America, is
Well,
that
yeah,
you're imagining that the Spanish decide
or the
not
French, the
not
French.
interested. The French are like, oh, this seems odd. Sure, jump off. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
the vision has to be, well, the British don't do this, and you're going to receive. I don't know if it's that sort of nobody ever comes, or that you receive easier handling from some other first contact, or a um a completely different history is I mean, it's like when you play these going back in time movies, and the butterfly, you change one thing and the world's completely different. We're not adjusting a butterfly here. We're rerunning millions and millions of people's lives and assuming, oh, everything would work out better.
it's silly counter history. The whole thing is just silly counter history, and that has no. I mean, it's fun to talk about it, but this has no place when you're defining public policy. And this is what we're talking about here. If we're going to start naming Dundas because it has a colonialist smell to it, what are we going to do about King Street? What are we going to do about Queen Street? What are we going to do about Adelaide? What are you going to do about Princess?
We're getting to them. We're getting to them in time. No, I mean, I'm not. I'm serious. We're getting to them in time is the idea, right? Because just in case you're listening and think that you're overstating the case, this is the quote. It says he generally represents systemic racism, colonial violence, and white supremacy embedded within statues, monuments, street name and places. The problem there is the overlap between, you say something like colonial violence, right? And that's that's like it's like generally represents the idea of the colonialists, of these people who have a better idea than the indigenous people, or even a more advanced society would be. Why is their society more advanced, right? um and the thing that I say to that is, well, you have to create, if you want to say, well, one society's better or not, or more advanced or not, or whatever, there's not, you have to have a yardstick by which to say that, right? The people who are in Britain in this time, in Scotland this time, they have their own yardstick. Their yardstick is, look at the ship we can build with you know what I mean? Look at the firearms we can bring to bear. Look at the power we can project around the world, right?
The argument is that the way we call our streets or the way we erect monuments is a daily reminder for some people of an oppressive past. And I'm sensitive to that. I'm sensitive to that. I don't dismiss that argument completely. But that being said, when you have, I wouldn't want to have a statue of a Confederate general in downtown Toronto. Why? Because the principles that this man would have defended are not principles that I would have ever recognized today, or I'm assuming in the 1860s. They're not part of our past. But Dundas, if we're going to keep it with Henry Dundas, was part of the Canadian past. King Street, because we've had kings. And if you don't like the fact that Canada is a constitutional monarchy, uh, then okay, you can argue against King Street or Queen Street or Princess Street or King Edward or Prince Edward or Victoria Park or whatever street we have. I mean, they are part of who we are. And I think that we have an opportunity to celebrate what we are. I think that we as Canadians are an honorable society, and I'll be the first to recognize the terrible errors that we've made in our past. And I would be also among the very first to say we need to recognize other people, other minorities that have been under celebrated, underappreciated. And the point I've made to the city of Toronto is that there's lots of opportunity here to celebrate those people who have been under recognized, to celebrate the communities and their achievements that have been under recognized in our city. Why not be generous with that? Keep Dundas Street, because the argument against that is wrong. But there are lots of streets that have absolutely no meaning. We have lots of parks that are utterly meaningless. They have been given names of third-rate aldermen, from the either the near past or the distant past, people who've never made a mark in society, except that for a few years they were aldermen. We have tons of opportunities to recognize the richness of the Canadian past. Why not spend the time on that instead of wasting money on something as silly as Dundas Street? Let's be creative. Let's be generous. Let's honor. The argument that, for example, we have a monument to the Irish refugees of the 1840s, right? You ever seen it?
No.
Well, it's because you can't see it. It's at the very tip of the island airport. It's a beautiful monument, Greg. It's a beautiful monument, but you can't see it. Um, I wish it was elsewhere, but the Irish, the people who put that thing together, like it there, and I think it's a terrible mistake. But that's another argument for another podcast. But so we have an Irish monument. Is my point. Why don't we have a monument to the Black Loyalists? Why don't we have a monument to the Chinese who've built this city of ours? Who've had such an important role in our city. Why don't we name streets in honor of Chinese Canadians who've been influential? There's lots of room for this. There's lots of room for this, and the city of Toronto has an opportunity to bring people together in being creative in remembrance. And we're not. Instead, we are pursuing this divisive debate on Dundas, and I find it, again, I find it sad and you know and destructive. I think it erodes the fiber of our city, and I wish that the city council and especially the staff was more creative in their approach to this.
Yeah, see, what I don't like about it is I think you should get a statue not for your worst day, but for your best day.
Well, good enough, yeah.
If you've done something which is distinguished enough that the people at the time gave you a statue, and then later we're saying, okay, well, the winds of the vagaries have changed, and we're changing things differently. Just because I read a whole bunch of Civil War, the actual generals have a whole variety of opinions on actual slavery. These people are not, uh, super rich slave owners and the thing is that they are just military people going about their business.
Well, it depends on who you're talking about, right?
That's fair enough. That's fair enough. But their
Yeah.
business is fighting war. This is what they do. And the other thing is, um, the the United States is not as united in their mind at the time, right? They're from Texas. They're from these states. And so the states going to war doesn't seem as much of a crazy internal thing. This is not to modify, in any way minimize the completely grotesque version of slavery that the people in the southern United States managed to come up with, and then it's even a gross version of slavery. Slavery's gross, and then it's one of the grosser versions of that.
Well, slavery is gross, period. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not
exactly.
sure I follow your logic there. It was a terrible thing, and the generals who defended slavery, in my mind, never deserved a monument because they were treasonous to their country. They were treasonous to the best ideals of humanity, and there is no reason for these people to be remembered. But we're in Canada here. That's a separate issue, and we do have an opportunity here to enact remembrance that is creative. You know, we don't in Toronto celebrate. No, the word celebrate is wrong. We don't remember enough, I think, our fallen soldiers. Uh, there's one cenotaph at the old city hall. Okay, it's not very much. In my mind, it's not very much. There should be more remembrance of the fallen, people who fought wars, world wars, as Canadians. I think that we should be doing more about that. I think that we should be honoring great scientists, great writers, important people who actually did something, who aspired to greater ideals for their countries, to use the words of the Governor General's awards, who aspired for a better country. We have a lot of opportunity to do that, and we just don't. We just don't. And so, Dundas is become um, uh, a lightning rod for this. And I think we should turn it around and say, look, we're just not doing enough, and we should be doing better. Let's cast aside Henry Dundas, leave things are as they are. And we talked about Ryerson for a second. It was the same kind of spirit. If there was an argument against Ryerson that said, you know, the Ryerson name simply does not resonate around the world. And, the university known as Ryerson, its future belongs in, a worldwide student body. And we just can't market Ryerson because it just doesn't mean anything. We need to have a name that is recognized worldwide. If they had said that, I certainly would not have been opposed. I said, okay, well, show me the market studies that tell you that if the university known as Ryerson would resonate better, would make more money internationally because it had a name that would tied it to its geography, then I'd say, okay, show me the study and I'd be willing to follow. But instead, we got into this campaign of denigration of Egerton Ryerson, throwing every insult at the man's memory, when in fact he is the founder of our public school system. Oh, and by the way, Henry Dundas also was a strong defender of Catholics. A lot of Catholic Scots, and Henry Dundas worked hard to protect the Catholics the Scottish Catholics. It's another important element of his thinking that I think is worth remembering.
Being protected from the Anglicans, right?
Well, the point is, he was protecting minorities, and Egerton Ryerson did the same thing.
I just wanted to shove in that the Catholics are minorities at this time, because somebody listening to the podcast might be like, why do the Catholics need protected? There's a lot of them. Not at this time, there's not.
And but it points to his mental his mental construct of society. I mean, he's a man who protected the people who needed protection. But as I say, this is the politics of memory, and unfortunately, we are infected with American thinking. And I am fully sympathetic to a lot of the American reaction in the summer of 2020, reacting against these important monuments in southern towns to what I consider, what anybody should consider, treasonous generals. And I've been to parts of the United States, and I could never believe what I saw. But it's different in Canada. It's a different debate in Canada, and we should be concerned about, not importing that kind of American habit.
But the same George Floyd argument went everywhere, regardless of the fact that
Yes,
it's
yes,
very hard to see what George Floyd links to protests in the UK,
yes.
which did disband slavery, and then produced a flotilla of militarized ships to make sure it stopped. Right? I mean, they patrolled, and if you were caught slaving, they'd blow your boat up, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but it's very. My point is, it didn't matter. What happened is the argument in the States was about poor handling, that minority communities feel that they've handled on the police. This becomes a symbol of it. Okay, that's one link. I gotcha. Okay, then we come to Canada that has a completely different police force, that has a completely different set of things to deal with, because the firearms in the States make everything different. Everything is different here. There is not that many police killings per capita at all.
Of course, people will say that it's not different, and
Right.
again, I'm not going to dismiss that out of hand, but the way we remember things is different, and I think we have to be more disciplined in how we approach these things. When you get the mayor and city council buying into this kind of logic, this is where I get concerned.
I think
And
I think it is slightly linked, though, because to set this process up, what you have to do is if I say, because if you notice, the names are becoming more meaningless, right? In terms of the gotcha of having a name and then something historical is found out about them, the naming of things the will become more and more, I don't know, unlinked to a particular person if time goes on.
and you wind up with a lot of American cities, First Avenue, Second Avenue, at Fourth Street, Fifth Street, Sixth Street. We can wind up in that kind of thing. And I'm not. It's easier to obviously to orient yourself when streets are named after letters and numbers, but on the other hand, I think it takes away from the charm. And we, a city of Toronto and Canada generally, we have not had First Street, A Avenue, or that kind of numbered grid. It's part of our tradition. I think we should keep it. I think there's just a lot of room to be creative here. And as I said, and I said to the city a couple of weeks ago, we need to have a committee, a permanent committee that looks at this, that systematically examines, like all the great cities in the world, that systematically examines city streets and says, has a process where things are assessed and reassessed, where you can say, this person was a notorious racist, and we should not have a street named after him. Does the record confirm it? Yes. Is there evidence? Yes. In that case, let's undergo the change and take a process, you know, do the consultations necessary, do the documentation necessary. There are a lot of people who deserve recognition, a lot of events deserve recognition, and we do nothing for them. And I think that as a society, as a city, we lose part of our soul. I mean, I think that we should be, adopting initiatives where the community is built up, not where the community is divided. And unfortunately, the mayor and the city council are on that route, on that path, and it's very sad. I think you know, they should be better than that.
And I am not in any way uh, do, um, saying that we should have names and monuments in which someone sees and is upset every day, right? But in this case, you can table that argument, because the historical reality of the person, you don't seem to have a lot of evidence verifying that assertion that their feelings are hurt is correct. Your point is their feelings shouldn't be hurt.
Yes.
We got lucky here because you can now take a grade school. I mean, the thing of it is that your argument that nobody knew what Dundas Street was, that's the old argument, because now it's going to be forever associated and upgraded to Henry Dundas, right?
Well, and I think that we should. I think that as a result of this, whenever a Dundas Street sign needs to be replaced, it should be called Henry Dundas. Under it, it should be written abolitionist and then his dates, 1742, 1811. But Henry Dundas, abolitionist, and then his dates. That's the way, if we're going to be historically accurate, that's the way we should be identifying Dundas Street.
I don't know why we can't have a monument or have something and say, well, this is a monument of this person, okay, but this monument is representing this person do a specific thing. Like you could contextualize it.
And Greg, with technology now, all you have to do is, put a Q code. Q code, is that what you call it?
It's called a QR code, but yeah.
QR code. I'm not a technical guy. A QR code. Put a QR code. And if somebody else wants to put another version of history, well, fine. A QR code, you can scan it and get another version of history. I'm not against that. I'm a historian by training. I know that interpretation is a sensitive thing. There is not one version of history. We're constantly looking for the best version of history that we can gather. It's a constant search, and there are very few people who do it. There are very few historians in this country. And, the historians that do exist in this country are scattered, a million miles thin, a million miles wide, but, a quarter of an inch thin. We don't have a lot of historians in this country. But I do agree that, there are different interpretations, and I'm not against that. Let's use technology. Let's be clever. Let's be progressive. And if like we have a John A. Macdonald statue at the tip of Queen's Park. It's been covered now for a couple of years for fear that it'll be torn down. Almost every other statue to John A. Macdonald has been destroyed or removed in this country. The only one left, as far as I know, is now on Parliament Hill, right? Parliament Hill and Queen's Park, but Queen's Park, it's been covered up. Why not use QR code? One day things will calm down, and John A. Macdonald statue will be exposed. If somebody wants to put a new version, an indigenous version of John A. Macdonald, I'm not against it. Put a QR code, people can scan it, people can get the indigenous version. I'm not against that. But the fact is, as you said earlier, John A. Macdonald did extraordinary things for our country and deserves a monument. And to point to another issue that you raised, this was done by public sponsorship. It was not the government who erected that statue to John A. Macdonald at Queen's Park. It was funded by the people. And when that statue was unveiled, there were tens of thousands of people at Queen's Park to unveil it. This was an expression of democratic will in gratitude to a man who had been prime minister for 20 years of our country. You can't have a mob of a dozen people tearing down monuments. That's not democratic. The monument was erected democratically through people's money. It can't be simply torn down with no punishment whatsoever by a dozen people who have an attitude problem.
Just what you said there, the one thing which seems like the postmodernist argument, well, everything can be interpreted a billion ways. I agree it can. But the thing that I always add is not without a factoring of probability on those interpretations.
Sure, absolutely. But let people decide.
You can read through the history of something and say, well, my interpretation is that this is, a story designed for you to not think it, to be anti the, nuclear energy industry. And you're like, okay, maybe it is, but I don't think so. And here's why, right? If you simply say, okay, well, everybody can have their interpretation of the history, right? You have to apply your logic as a human on planet Earth and have a historian who has read these things to sit there and throw out the fact that, for example, when he puts gradually in, your suggestion is that that's what he can get done today, and that's his way out of slavery, right? And someone else says, no, that's his way of keeping slavery. So we have two interpretations of the same event now, right? But are they equally valid? And your point is the more and the deeper you look into it, the more the idea that this is valid pulls apart. Ryerson is the same thing, right? You read this blurb about industrial schools that he's thinking of constructing, or not constructing, commenting on what could be done because he's an expert in education, right? Um, and you're like, okay, and then you're like, well, he was a missionary out with the Mississauga and farmed with them, and learned enough language to
Yes.
get by and ended up with an indigenous name. Okay, well, once you take that piece of history into account, you can use your experience of a human on Earth.
Yes.
This interpretation doesn't make sense, right? Like your interpretation, your interpretation flies in the face of my experience as a human on Earth and how people work, right?
And I'm with you, and I think that people should be allowed to make their own judgment of that. And if a group wants to contest, which is what's happened, right? This has been our history for the last 5 6 years, where people have contested the existence of statues, whether it's Johnny MacDonald or Egerton Ryerson, or anybody else. If you want to contest it, that's fine, but you don't need to be violent about it, and you don't need to. As I say, there's room here for lots of interpretations. Why did we not come to some sort of agreement on Johnny McDonald and adopt Q codes? That would, I'm sure, have appealed to reasonable people, or at least would have created a constituency of reasonable people. I can use a lighter example, but it'll illustrate my point. A few years ago, a statue was erected in Ottawa in honor of Oscar Peterson, the great Black Canadian jazz pianist. So let's say you don't like jazz. Let's say you vehemently are opposed to the idea that Oscar Peterson should be honored with a monument in downtown Ottawa. And let's say there was a constituency of opinion of people who are really hostile to jazz to the point of violence. Why not? It could happen. It could happen. You know, you can have an anti-jazz manifesto, but don't destroy the statue, because Oscar Peterson was a fantastic jazz pianist. You know, it's something that there's lots of opportunities for us to project our own interpretation of history onto monuments. It doesn't all necessarily have to be negative. And again, that's barring the 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 proviso. I mean, it's again of making sure that we do not have monuments that are um, that commemorate people who are horrifically um, nefarious to human existence. Who are murderous. We don't have that in this country. We just don't. And I think that we need to have leaders in the country who are willing to be more courageous in their adoption of policy, and who are willing to be entrepreneurial in gathering around them the people who will put together a cultural policy that makes sense. This is infecting everything. My point is, it's not just about plaques and streets. We now have a policy in the city of Toronto that is moving forward along the same lines regarding the city museums, so that basically our history, the museum collections are going to be um, are going to be relieved of anything that might be culturally objectionable. So we're looking at potentially, if we're now in this anti-colonialist mode, why should we have Fort York? I mean, Fort York was a colonial barracks installed to protect the British Empire. It has absolutely no place in 21st century Toronto. We should remove it. That would be the logic. And that is the logic that is moving forward in the city of Toronto now. The city of Toronto is adopting a policy that's going in that direction. So,
The continuation of the logic doesn't work, because if somebody sits there and they say, um, because this was basically the end of the argument. The Ryerson thing ended with the statement that was basically like, well, there might be no meat on the bone, but people are upset, and a significant number of people are upset, so we're changing it because people are upset. That was my interpretation.
yes. Oh, you're right.
There was no defense coming out of the count, the people that looked into it. It was just like, well, people are upset. Well, the problem is then, as you said, someone is upset with uh, um, The problem is somebody can be upset with anything. And I say this and people don't like this, but the reality is on earth, no one cares about your feelings. No one cares. And no, I'm telling you, here is how I illustrate this point. Let's say you're having a barbecue or a family event with your wife or your girlfriend or whatever, right? Your mom comes, you have a nice meal. Your wife, your mother leaves, and then your wife or partner says to you, I feel I don't like your mother and I don't want her back here again. That's her feelings. The next thing you say, the next thing everyone says is, well, hold on. What did she do? What did you see? And you then go through a rational process of pulling apart this person's behavior, right? But your wife and girlfriend cannot stand up on, and this is an intimate person in your life, I feel I don't like this. Like, I can't think of any example where someone can just profess this feeling and expect everyone else in the world to act on it.
There has to be compromise. There has to be compromise, and that's what I'm saying. The governments, the government leaders need to be more creative in finding ways of accommodating. And there's lots of room in this field to accommodate. We don't need to destroy anything. We should be building more stuff. We should be building more commemoration. We should be doing better. That's my point.
Well, but my secondary point is it doesn't end at this. So somebody says, "Well, this statue upsets me," right? Okay, so I want it gone. Fair enough. It's upsetting you. I want it gone. The colonialist names upset me. I want it gone, right? The problem is how many leaps is it to just saying the existence of white people upset me, or the existing of Asians upset me, because like let's face it, if you are a Chinese citizen living now in Canada, you have lots to be upset with by handling of the Japanese. Like there is a rich history of things you could be upset about.
Listen, yeah, of course, of course.
My point is, you can't raise your hand and say, um, if you are Chinese Canadian, you can't say, well, I'm upset that the first grade teacher of my kid is a Japanese uh, Canadian, and oh, look at the handling. I'll explain the handling of that the Chinese received of the Japanese, and you're like, well, hold on, you can't do that because you know what I mean? You go through this whole lot. My point is the
Yep,
feeling is
yep,
normally not enough to get any action anywhere. People go, well,
yep.
hold on, is your feeling reasonable? And it goes through a reasonable standard. And to me, what this change is what they're trying to do is they're trying to change the reasonable standard.
I agree.
Yeah,
I
they're
agree.
trying to change what the standard of reasonability is to be like, well, I feel this way, without
Yes,
realizing that the other voices, or however you want to say it in newspeak, they will get upset about things too, right? There,
sure. It's very short-sighted. Yeah,
because you picked this Dundas thing. Um, uh, the average person's like, I'm not going to go down to City Hall. I mean, you know what I mean, and engage on it, and then the money, sort of came up and blustered up as a thing. But on the Ryerson front, because this is going to continue. This is not the last dance of this, right? It's going to target something new next.
oh, I mean, in terms of universities, for sure. I mean, it's look at all our universities. We have, Brock University was named after a colonialist. Carleton University was named after a colonialist. Queen's University is named after the ultimate colonialist. I mean, it doesn't end. It doesn't end. Laurier, Prime Minister of Canada, Laurier did a lot of things that were wrong.
Ryerson has given you the solution. Queens will just be Toronto East University. Brock will just be Toronto South University.
West, South, yes.
And if you need a new name, just steal the name of another university, put it on your buildings, and continue on.
That may be the solution, and that's such a sad, it's such a sad commentary on the leadership, on our public leadership, that would be the kind of thing that we come up with. And especially in the case of Ryerson, I mean, we adopted a colonialist name, metropolitan. A metropole is the capital city of an empire. I mean, we have adopted a colonialist moniker. It's the silliest thing.
Well, plus the other thing, and I listen. I have been to the bucolic fields of U of T in Western Canada to learn farming. What are you talking about? It's in the same city. U of T is also a metropolitan university. You're lucky I don't work at U of T. I would have sued day one. Day one, I would have
Oh,
sued. My lawyers are a coming. Because, and listen, not to give them ideas, because you are brand conflicting. You mean to tell
yes.
me that someone that's going to send their kid to Canada okay, that may not even have English as a first language or speak it at all.
Yes. They thought they're going to U of T.
They think they're going to U of T. There's no way. There's no way they don't. There's no way. And so I was just like, I mean, listen, my fear, I thought I was talking to someone, I'm like, it's going to be the lamest name ever. They're going to call it Progress University. I'm sure of it. It's going to be called Progress University.
Yes. But you see, that would fail the test. But that would have failed the test because it did not tie the city to its geography. And Progress University wouldn't have been any better than Ryerson University. That would have been the worst of the worst. A lot of people were talking about RU Reconciliation University. I thought that would never meet the test because it meant nothing. It would mean nothing to anybody.
Yeah. Plus, again, and then now you're on my reconciliation banjo. But my reconciliation banjo is I don't like this word at all because reconciliation implies a previous state of togetherness. It's just like if you could just smooth over these rough edges, we could get this couple back together. You know what I mean? That's the kind of reconciliation idea. Instead of you sitting there and saying, no, no, you've told two totally different cultures. They're not even on the same dimension of how to resolve things or legalistic structures or this kind of like mechanicalist thinking. Like the Romans and the Greeks, and which we kind of got rebooted in the Enlightenment. And back to the Enlightenment period, you can tell how obsessed these people are by this history because they paint it. They make
Yeah,
statues of it. They're like,
sure.
talk about statues.
That's the Renaissance. That's the Renaissance.
They re-enliven it. And across from David in Italy is a statue, sort of illustrate like as a pictorial of the illustration of the abduction of the Servine women from Rome. Okay, so obviously nobody's looking at this and saying, "Well, this statue seems to be promoting the abduction of women." That's not. That's it's just a monument to a point in history that they consider
Yeah.
significant. That's it. I mean, how many paintings are of the abduction of the Servine women by artists and no by artists of the day? Right, everyone's painting this thing. Nobody sits there and goes, "This must have been a promotion of this. They must be
Yeah.
promoting the abduction of
Yes.
women." Because,
Yeah.
like,
No, it's no. All of this to say that we are historically illiterate, and we need. My plea is that we need to, improve our game considerably, so as to bring people together and not use history to divide people, but to use history to unite people. We all have some good history together. We all have some good history, and there's deep knowledge in history in the sense that if you do want to understand the way Canada is today, you do have to understand history, and history is worth studying, good and bad. And
I would suggest though that the structure is rattling a little bit more than that. In that you have to have buy-ins that like the history matters or that it's your history or that the past can teach you something about the future. There's a whole bunch of buy-ins and a lot of not listen, I don't know the people per se who, created this petition or are really, passionate about it, right? But the the underlying context of like why have a society at all is going away, right? Like why you've got a whole bunch of people who are running on a completely different framework, right? And maybe it is the framework that um, some people do believe it. Like for example, you don't punish kids for the sins of the father or the mother, depending on the time, right? This is like a construction that
yes,
people have. Again, it's a 3,000-year-old construction of how you should.
yeah,
This is like fading where people are like, why
yes,
not? Why shouldn't I take this kid's house away if his dad was a bastard? His dad used the money to send it to university, and like it's like the chain of construction is huge. So I do think we're getting a group of people who just think to themselves, if you bash the whole current structure down and just put me in charge, which is not in any way a give it, a foregone
yeah,
conclusion. I myself will invent this thing. It will
yes,
be pure. It won't be beset of problems. It'll have all these structures and these things in. And I always say, if you want to smash the current society, which provides incredible amounts of wealth and security um, uh, for a huge number of people, you got to tell me what you're going to.
yeah, and it's not a perfect society, but we're trying. We're sure
No,
trying.
I mean, but again, you to create that thing, you have to not to get into Glenn Lowry's whole speech, but you have to have some other society, right? It's like
Yep.
saying
Yep.
it's like nobody thinks their dad was perfect or their mom was perfect. Like, does anybody think that? But unless but it's to your point, unless your dad and your mom was this completely grotesque character, you know
Right.
what I mean? You still go to Thanksgiving and you say, "Dad, I was hurt that you never showed up for my softball game when I
Right.
was 12." But the standard is not perfection. As long as you have that, we're getting hoisted on this standard of perfection because it seems like when you say, well, hold on, they did eventually get rid of slavery, right? You're making excuses for that 12-year period or that person and discounting the trauma, right?
To finish off on Dundas, what I always find amazing is that Wilberforce, when he was in his final kick to end slavery, called his society for the gradual elimination of slavery. It was an association for the gradual. So he actually used the word that Henry Dundas had used 30 years before to make it acceptable. He
Right.
used the word gradual. And I think that there's no better endorsement of Henry Dundas's strategy and Henry Dundas's name uh, to show that Dundas was in fact a good man, and that we in Toronto should, keep the name Dundas, regardless of whether there's an association with him or not, because it's an honorable name.
Well, thanks very much for your time on this, Patrice, and thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, sir.